Welcome to Chelsea's Vocation. Chelsea raised two children on the autism spectrum, Justus and Noey, into adulthood. They're the reason why she can't help but smile when she recognizes autism in another human, especially a child. Chelsea spent almost 2 decades studying this neurotype as a parent professional, learning how to better adapt her own behavior and the environment around autistic children to both encourage and foster their development. She hopes through this podcast that you might better understand how neurotypical people process your neurology if you're autistic, or how to better yourself as someone who values autistic humans and your relationship with them. Chelsea is a lifelong learner and expects you are too, so don't hesitate to reach out to her through social media comments or the contact form on our website with your own insights. If you're coming to this podcast after the first 5 episodes, you may want to go to the show and review one or more of those foundational episodes to know where she's coming from. Either way, we're glad you're here now.
Rates of bullying in the general American youth population have remained between 20 and 30% for more than a decade. However, the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics indicates that more than 2 in 5 children ages 12 to 17 with a developmental disability will be bullied. That's 42% higher than neurotypical teens. And when we're talking specifically about autistic learners, it's even worse. According to an article published in 2014 in Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders, 3 in 4 autistic youth report being bullied, and most of that bullying is chronic. So really, it's not whether your autistic learner will be bullied, but if and or when. That's the bad news. While definitions of bullying may differ and regulations regarding bullying may vary on local and state levels, federal law protects against disability harassment. Simply put, bullying on the basis of disability may be considered disability harassment, which is in violation of 3 federal laws: the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Specifically, disability harassment is illegal discrimination on the basis of disability that creates a hostile environment and/or results in adverse action. For students in special education, this may become a matter of consideration in their Individualized Education Plan, or IEP. If a student is afraid to go to school or is placed in a more restrictive environment to be insulated against bullying behavior, this could be a denial of a free appropriate public education, or FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, or the LRE. This is per the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And schools act in loco parentis, thereby assuming a duty of care and protection to ensure the safety and well-being of students. This includes responsibility for keeping students safe from bullying and harassment during school hours and at school-sponsored activities. So let's talk first about the 4 types of bullying or harassment that may impact autistic learners. And if you're watching the video version of this episode, you'll see this as a slide. There's physical, what I call published, relational, and experimental. First, physical, which is the type most reported according to the article published in Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders. This is a direct form of bullying, and it's just as you'd expect, with a physical aspect of it. But where it might be considered disability harassment for autistic learners is when it's targeting sensory perceptive differences and/or tactile defensiveness. I'm actually going to share a case study involving my son Justus, and as you hear these different kinds of bullying and the descriptions of them, I want you to think about which types would be included in this case study scenario. The second type of bullying is what I call published, and this involves verbal or written, whether it's spoken or typed, whether it's on paper or electronically. This could be graphic as well, whether that's analog or digital. This would include cyberbullying. This can be direct or indirect. Cyberbullying is really tricky because unless it happens on school grounds and/or with a school-provided device, it's difficult to get the school to assume responsibility. The third type is relational, and again, this can be direct or indirect. I think of relational as it relates to autism, particularly as exclusion, whether you're being excluded by a certain individual or it's a group effort. Relational could be taunting an autistic learner, as in daring them or goading them to do something. The fourth form of bullying, which is again direct or indirect, and I think this is especially targeting autistic students, is experimental. Oftentimes, those demonstrating this bullying behavior are betting on a child's social communication challenges. So, what will happen if we ask this student to dot, dot, dot? So, I'm going to use my son Justus as an example. This is a real situation that happened to him when he was in eighth grade. He became a target of three boys during a phy ed class. Because Justus has a mitochondrial myopathy, which means that his cells process energy differently than those without a mitochondrial disorder, prolonged physical activity can actually be painful because the muscle tissue can be attacked. So when it comes to, say, running laps in a gym, and that's what this included, Justus is going to go a lot slower and he's going to tire a lot more quickly than his peers. So these three boys, as they were doing laps around the gym for warm-ups, wondered what would happen if they poked Justus on the shoulder every time they passed him. So these three boys were traveling together. Justus was by himself, and they very subtly would poke Justus on the shoulder. Didn't look like a big deal, just a little tap, but they knew that Justus would respond in a big way to that tap. Justus was really tactile defensive. He really did not want people to touch him on the shoulder in particular. So they were able to go around laps in the gym and do this subtle poke that nobody else would have noticed. And they knew that they were doing it, of course, and Justus became increasingly agitated until eventually he lashed out with a verbal threat against three boys. Now, of course, that loud verbal threat is what was overheard by the teacher, certainly not observed by all of the times that these boys were antagonizing Justus. So I get a phone call as the parent, as Justus's mom, Justus who just threatened these three boys. And I asked what the context was here, because the phy ed teacher was saying that I needed to deal with Justus's threat against these students. I knew Justus wasn't going to threaten anyone out of nowhere. And so I asked what precipitated this, and the phy ed teacher had no idea. Because Justus's phy ed teacher didn't know what provoked this threat, we decided that it might be a good idea to have a peer buddy go around with Justus during warm-up time to see if we could figure out why these boys were being threatened by Justus, what was going on here. And what the peer buddy was able to figure out is that Justus was being poked, that they were doing this deliberately, and they thought it was funny. When I got a call back from the phy ed teacher about this behavior, I said, look, I'm not going to press charges. And he was just shocked that I would even say that. And I said, oh, maybe you misunderstand. Justus's threat is in response to disability harassment. And while he shouldn't have threatened these boys have no business doing this to Justus. And this is a violation of 3 federal laws. So I recommend that we have a conversation with these boys, maybe even bring in the school resource officer and talk about the consequences of violating 3 federal laws. When you talk about disability harassment and you bring that language into the conversation and you tell students that this is illegal behavior, they're going to listen a whole lot better than thinking they were just doing something that they thought was funny, that they thought was harmless. This is not harmless behavior at all. When students know, when peers know that this is a matter of legality, not just moral high ground, they're way more likely to take their own reactions seriously. So basically what we did is we identified who the aggressors were, and instead of blaming Justus as a victim, we made sure to hold the aggressors accountable. By having a peer support in that mix, we were able to move the situation from helplessness on Justus's part as a target to being able to either stand up for himself or have the bystander stand up, that peer buddy, act as an intermediary between Justus and the aggressors. So when you think about this case study, which types of bullying do you identify of those 4 in this scenario? I definitely noticed the physical because of Justus's tactile defensiveness. They weren't punching him, they weren't kicking him, but they were doing something that they knew physically would get a reaction out of him. And that's the second part, is experimental. They hoped that by poking Justus on the shoulder, it would elicit a big reaction, which it did. And I think they were trying to figure out how long they could get away with it, and they nearly did. I'll give you another example of physical as it might relate specifically to autism. And for this example, I'm going to use my youngest, Noey. So Noey has reported some interesting differences in the way they receive audio input. For example, Noey hears flying insects as loudly as some of us might hear a helicopter. I remember when Noey was in elementary school, we went to a baseball game. And as we were walking into the stadium, there was a home run and the entire crowd went wild. Noey immediately put her hands over her ears and said, "Mom, this is what flying insects sound like to me." So that's the kind of loudness that Noey would hear from the frequency of a bug's wings. Now, I don't think that Noe's classmates really understood how loud that was to Noey. They just knew that if Noey heard a flying insect, it would be a big reaction. It would be hands over the ears. Noey would naturally be really afraid of that kind of a sound because it was so loud and it was so disruptive to Noe's learning. And so one of the forms of bullying, specifically disability harassment, because again, this was targeting Noe's heightened sense of hearing, is they would say, "Oh, Noe, there's a bee in the classroom," or "Oh, Noe, here's a big fly." And of course, that would cause Noe to look around frantically, anxiously, putting hands over ears. And they just thought that was funny. And it's not. And of course, while those students might laugh thinking it was funny and then go back into their work, Noe would have to spend several minutes recovering from that cortisol dump, from the stress that that induced. And yes, that kind of disability harassment is going to interfere with Noe being able to receive a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. Sometimes when we talk about that relational form of bullying, we think it's not really a big deal. In fact, I've seen lots of situations where students with autism are somehow blamed for that kind of relational bullying, for things like exclusion. And I think it's really important to note that in the National Bullying Prevention Center, they had an article that they cited from 2022. And it said, quote, "When youth are excluded from social activities by their peers at school, the outcomes for that student will be just as detrimental as if they got kicked, punched, or slapped every day." That article was about bullying in the general population. It wasn't even specifically about students with autism or other learning disabilities. And just remember, all of these articles that I'm citing are going to be linked in the show notes for you. So what can we do to prevent some of these bullying behaviors? Well, in this article from the Autism Research Review International in 2020, it says, quote, "Teachers have a key role to play. In school settings, evidence suggests that intensive anti-bullying interventions in which teachers meet with parents are most effective. Schools can also benefit from autism-specific anti-bullying strategies, including befriending interventions, which help autistic children form friendships with neurotypical peers." I'm going to really get into the resources in this podcast. And again, I hope you go to the show notes because I'm going to link all of this information there. The resources are going to go over everything from how to report bullying to your child's school, to working through the IEP to be able to put maybe some peer education in there, maybe to put some other preventative things into the IEP that will protect against bullying, hopefully prevent bullying. And then the school has to be effective in how to manage it afterwards. So let's go through some of these resources. And again, if you're watching the video version of this, you'll see a slide with these first 4 resources. First of all, the U.S. Department of Education. This is a great place to start. That's where you're going to find information about these federal laws that I talked about and how the U.S. Department of Education enforces those laws. The Education Department also has these Dear Colleague letters. There have been several written over the years. It's the Office of Civil Rights that actually upholds Section 504 of the Rehab Act and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability. If you're in the state of Wisconsin, there's actually Wisconsin Statute 118.46, which has a policy on bullying. All schools must have and post a detailed bullying policy that includes an education and awareness program. Now, it doesn't mean that those things are funded, but it does mean that they have to have some sort of a program that includes bullying awareness and prevention programs. So if your child is experiencing bullying and they're in a state of Wisconsin school, I would encourage you to check with the district and find out exactly what their policy is on bullying. If you can't get a satisfactory answer from your school's administrator, you can go to the district level. If the district isn't helping out, maybe at the level of special education or a director of pupil services, then you might consider filing a complaint with the Department of Public Instruction at the state level. There are processes for mediation in place for that, but then if that doesn't work either, you can certainly escalate it to a federal level and make a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. If you're trying to do something more proactive on a school level, or if you're a teacher or administrator, you might look at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction's School Resource Toolkit for Bullying Prevention. Another resource for schools, and they do engage parents too, but it really is meant mostly for educators, administrators, is Wisconsin's Supporting Neurodiverse Students program. A lot of great resources for teachers, for students, for families come from PACER's National Bullying Prevention Center. They've got resources for kindergarten through 12th grade youth, families, and educators. PACER also has these great template letters that you can use to notify your learner's school about a bullying situation. It also has information on how to use the IEP to address bullying concerns. They also have an all-in toolkit for schools. In Autism Speak School Community Toolkit, there are some pages about bullying. As it kind of said in one of the previous articles, creating a culture of kindness is probably the best thing you can do to prevent bullying or disability harassment. There are resources for that in the state of Wisconsin as part of that Chapter 118 in the Wisconsin statutes. There's Bullying Awareness Day, which is observed on the Wednesday of the fourth week in September. There are some other kind of national efforts that are more media focused. PACER has Unity Day, which in 2026 will be observed on Wednesday, October 21st. And that will be about wearing and sharing orange as a visible message of kindness, acceptance, and inclusion to prevent bullying. Stomp Out Bullying has the World Day of Bullying Prevention on the first Monday in October, and that's to wear blue to practice bullying prevention. And then there's lots of ways to accomplish peer education, whether it's using resources that PACER has. They do have a book club. Autism Speaks has something in their toolkit. The Organization for Autism Research has resources. Even through Chelsea's Vocation, when I do student training, I have curated YouTube videos that I share with kids and explain. It really breaks my heart when I hear of a family that has chosen to homeschool their learner with autism because they just can't get a satisfactory resolution to the bullying that's going on in that school. It's totally unacceptable to me. And while I appreciate people's decision to homeschool, it should never be because bullying and disability harassment is going unchecked. What are some things that you've done, whether as an educator, an administrator, or a parent, that have helped resolve bullying situations, help prevent them? It would be great to have a conversation get started. Go to our social media pages and make a comment, or drop a note right here on the platform that you're listening in. I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Chelsea's Vocation. We hope it was valuable to you. If it was, we'd appreciate you sharing it with someone, reviewing it, and/or rating it. Subscribe to the podcast to be notified when new episodes are published. We wish you the best as you learn, maybe unlearn, and do better for yourself and those around you. Chelsea encourages you to be gentle with yourself, be gracious with others, and be protective of your own and others' dignity. Until next time, take care.